Would you have freedom from wage slavery, then join in the grand industrial band? Would you for misery and hunger be free, then come do your share hand in hand? There is power in a band of working men.
That was a song called There Is Power in the Union, written by labor union hero Joe Hill. Joe Hill not only wrote songs, he also wrote articles in labor union papers and was known to draw comics for those same publications. He was ultimately shot by a firing squad in 1915 following a controversial trial which accused him of murdering a grocery clerk. His influence on labor union organizations, however, lives on.
Stop here with the rags on your back. There is power in a band of working folk when they stand hand in hand. That's a power that must rule in every land. One industrial union grand.
This podcast, we will explore labor rights in cartoons and comics from the early 1900s up until the early 1940s and their positive influence on the success of workers' rights movements in North America. While initially pro-union cartoons like Mr. Block were primarily found in the pages of Industrial Workers of the World papers, thanks to commercial artists such as Art Young and Ralph Chaplin, the messaging ultimately made its way into the pages of national newspapers, and by the late 1930s and into the 1940s, pro-union sentiment was also depicted in mainstream comics like Superman and Don Winslow of the Navy. Although this podcast will argue that pro-labor comics help non-unionized and unionized workers positively, academic Linda Lumsden disagrees, stating the cartoons featured in IWW papers, quote, unwittingly contain disempowering messages that may have repelled possible converts, unquote. In order to drive home their argument, Lumsden points to the lack of marginalized people, the portrayal of hapless loyal workers, violent rhetoric, as well as other valid considerations as potential deterrents. Lumsden is correct in pointing out those flaws. However, this podcast will examine other elements which maintain that labor comics had a long-lasting and influential impact on the rights of workers in North America. Labor comics didn't come into their own until the industrial workers of the world recognized the impact cartoons and comics could have in spreading their message. Indeed, comics are very inclusive. Images contained within comics have the ability to communicate to those who perhaps are not fully literate, whether that be due to people having to leave school at an early age in order to find work, or new immigrants who may not have English as their first language. It is interesting to note that it hasn't been until fairly recently that academics and educators like Gretchen E. Schwartz have recognized that comics not only have the ability to, quote, promote literacy, end quote, but, quote, may require more cognitive skills than reading text alone, end quote. Sean Carlson holds that comics can help readers to, quote, actively construct, critically interpret, and consciously reflect on and relate to specific messages, end quote. While perhaps the readers and writers of those early wobbly cartoons didn't analyze the work in those terms, there is no question that they must have recognized their ability to spread messages to a vast array of people, because comics in IWW papers took far more room than in any other union or socialist paper at that time. The IWW was formed at a time when the United States was increasingly becoming an industrial powerhouse. People from all over the world were flooding into the United States and into its many factories in order to feed the huge industrial machine. In order to make themselves heard, workers of all stripes, carpenters, bricklayers, unskilled laborers, organized. While skilled laborers, who were already earning more than their unskilled counterparts, had powerful unions like the American Federation of Labor to champion their cause, unskilled laborers did not. Enter the IWW. Finally, there was a place for all laborers, no matter what race, sex, or religion. In a time before the internet and television, papers and pamphlets led the way for disseminating their messages. Humor was an often used device in wobbly cartoons to spread their sober messages, as it was thought poking fun at capitalism was instrumental in bringing it down. The majority of the cartoons were single-panel gag cartoons, such as the one written by Joe Hill titled Constitutional Guarantee, Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of a Job. Despite it being a single panel, there's a lot that can be gleaned when reading it. First of all, like all cartoons printed in the so-called radical press, it was drawn in black and white. As Lumsden points out, using black and white is a powerful metaphor for the political messages contained within. Hill's cartoon shows a man with migrant worker stenciled on his shirt chasing Lady Liberty holding a pork chop. An old man sitting on the porch of a grocery store in the background yells, "Hey lad, why don't you stay in one place and vote the socialist ticket?" Another detail on the comic shows the presumably company store is owned by A. Cockroach. Funny stuff! Like many IWW comic writers, Joe Hill was not a trained artist, and it's evident in the crudeness of the drawing. However, that does not diminish its impact. While not as prevalent, comic strips were also used. Some merely mimic cartoons of the day like Mutt and Jeff, such as the one shown in the August 1926 issue of Industrial Pioneer. Imposter Mutt says, "What right have those workers to tie up our factories?" Imposter Jeff responds, "Our factories? We don't even own the smoke." Mutt then falls through a hole in the pavement. Unfortunately, many radical paper comic writers, such as the one who wrote that cartoon, have not been properly identified.
Oh, please give me your attention, and I'll introduce to you a man that is a credit to our red, white, and blue. His head is made of lumber and is solid as a rock. He is a common worker, and his name is Mr. Block. And Mr. Block thinks he may be president someday. Oh, Mr. Block, you were born by mistake. You take the cake, you make me ache.
Perhaps the most well-known IWW comic strip at that time was Mr. Block, written by Ernest Reeb. While not much is known about Reeb other than his country of origin and his political motivations, his character Mr. Block was a hit. Historians like Franklin Rosemont have suggested Mr. Block was a, and I quote, forerunner of the underground comics that began to appear in the 1960s, end quote. One can appreciate that sentiment when analyzing Mr. Block. Like underground comics writers, Ernest Reeb was not beholden to a publisher. He could write and draw what he wanted. Like many IWW artists, he was not a professional, which would also allow Reeb to draw what he felt was important. Also similar to the underground comics movement was his subject matter, which was considered, and I quote, revolutionary. With a block of wood for a head, Mr. Block would often tout the merits of being a person without the need of a union. He would always end up the worst of it. An example is one titled He Works in the Woods, which was published in the Industrial Worker on December 26, 1912. Mr. Block decides to work as a lumberjack without union backing, and in the end finds that not only has he been worked to the bone, he also owes the company $1.50 for a variety of made-up expenses. While walking away, Mr. Block grumbles, "Maybe those IWWs were right. Perhaps I'll join them when they get a little stronger." Poking fun at workers who poo-pooed the IWW was undoubtedly seen as rebellious and insulting to company owners, managers, and loyal workers. However, its impact was most assuredly felt. Judging by the amount of interest Reeb and Mr. Block still have in the present day by not only academics but artists too, suggests that Reeb's comics must have had a continuing and lasting impact on the labor movement. Serious political or editorial cartoons also found their way into the pages of labor union papers and pamphlets. These were perhaps the most potent form of comic for the pro-labor movement. According to Sherry and George and Sonny Liu in their book Red Lines, Political Cartoons and the Struggle Against Censorship, political cartoons are, quote, one of humankind's most effective symbolic weapons, end quote. Sometimes those messages can be so powerful that they put the cartoonists themselves at risk. Two of the most prominent political cartoonists of the time, Ralph Chaplin and Art Young, demonstrate examples of the risks cartoonists took while sharing their art. Chaplin, for example, was thrown in jail for ostensibly opposing the First World War, but probably more due to his pro-labor messaging, which forced him to put his career on hold. There are countless examples of Chaplin's work, but one that stands out is titled Now He Understands the Game. It shows a businessman hiding behind a game labeled Hocus Pocus, featuring political candidate marionettes. A speech bubble, reminiscent of those shown in Yellow Kid cartoons, suggests a vote for any one of them will lead a person to salvation. A clearly labeled class-conscious worker looks on, while the businessman mutters, "I don't think he's wise to the game yet." Chaplin is also noted for inventing the ubiquitous Sabo cat, a black cat which to this day is featured on all manner of pro-worker materials, from books to t-shirts, a testament to the endurance of Chaplin's work. Young's political cartoons were so potent he was forced to go to trial. He had to defend work like Having Their Fling, which showed a minister, a capitalist, a politician, and an editor dancing to music conducted by a devil-like character. While he narrowly escaped prosecution, it was evident that the establishment was intimidated by his work. In fact, the trial led to the end of The Masses, the magazine which first published the work. Perhaps one of Young's most potent cartoons is titled The Lawrence Way, printed in 1912 and published both in The Industrial Worker and the more mainstream Collier's Weekly, in which it shows a giant policeman with a bloodied truncheon beating starving mill workers with their families and children. The image must have had a major impact on the many people who saw it for the first time and were aware of the events it was referencing. Unlike most of the writers in labor union papers, Young and Chaplin were professionals who not only shared their work with labor papers, but also got paid to show their work in mainstream newspapers. Young in particular did very well, having his work printed in Life magazine and the Saturday Evening Post, despite his anti-establishment messaging. It's particularly interesting to note that despite the government and capitalist establishment attempting to paint these illustrators as communist radicals, they were still able to thrive in a medium that was becoming very anti-communist in its messaging. Indeed, the Red Scare of 1919 to 1920 saw a proliferation of anti-communist editorial cartoons. One in particular by J.N. Ding Darling, named There Are Moments When Married Life Seems Quite Endurable Even to a Man Who Thinks He's Henpecked, displays a man holding a red flag thrown to the bottom of the stairs by a woman labeled U.S. Labor, shouting, "Who told you I needed any help to manage my husband?" The husband, labeled Capital, hides behind the woman. The cartoon is an obvious attempt to portray capitalists and workers as a united front. It is quite apparent there was a large effort to silence voices like Chaplin and Young. However, by the 1930s, American radicals like them had become very influential and powerful union leaders. As the Great Depression began to subside, workers again began to organize. However, this time the focus was establishing a strong bureaucratic network. Due to the workers' powerful front, big business had no choice but to work with the unions. The unions, too, had also begun to recognize that in order to work, the capitalist machine must chug on. Even the left-leaning publication Daily Worker was attempting to minimize communism's revolutionary principles, contends academic Edward Brunner. Of particular interest is, in an attempt to appeal to an adult reader, Daily Worker comic Comrade Kitty employed block letter techniques similar to Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan rather than speech bubbles. The women in Comrade Kitty, too, were portrayed as intelligent, sophisticated go-getters, similar in tone to the women's comics of the 1970s. While the Daily Worker contained influential cartoons like Comrade Kitty, the real point at which pro-union comics saw its influence enter mainstream consciousness was in Action Comics No. 3, published in August 1938, where Superman uses his power to help union workers. Unlike the stark black-and-white union cartoons of the radical press, the workers in the Action comic were shown in bright, flashy colors. In addition, the audience which consumed its message was a broad section of society rather than a small subsect. The comic story shows Superman's alter ego Clark Kent going undercover in order to save some trapped miners who were being exposed to a noxious gas. While on the site, Superman not only saves the miners but also exposes safety concerns at the mine site. While visiting a miner who Superman had saved, it is revealed that safety concerns were dismissed by the owners. Interestingly, the miner speaks in a manner which suggests he was originally from an Eastern European country, perhaps a nod by writer Jerry Siegel to the so-called red comics of the past. Later on in the story, the owner and his compatriots find themselves trapped in a mine and discover that the safety devices were not working, prompting him to declare, "I never knew what the men down here had to face," which prompts the owner to begin to treat his workers with respect. In the years following, which continued into the mass production required to fuel the Second World War, workers' rights were discussed in many comic books, from Don Winslow of the Navy to Zambini. Labor rights messaging had finally made it to the masses. In the end, despite flaws in its messaging, labor comics had moved from the fringes of society to the very center of the mainstream population. Early iconic labor comic characters like Mr. Block and the Sabo Cat have not disappeared into the past, but rather, as a validation of the impact of workers' rights comics, have expanded their influence. The fact that workers' rights made their way into colored comics, which cater to the mass population, further proves their effectiveness. Indeed, thanks to the work of people like Ernest Reeb, Art Young, Ralph Chaplin, and Jerry Siegel, the rights of workers to live a life free of exploitation is now an expectation rather than an exception. And that brings us to the end of my podcast. Thanks for listening.
Hand in hand, that's a power that must rule in every land. One industrial union grand. Would you have mansions of gold in the sky and live in a shack in the back? Would you have wings up in heaven to fly and starve here with rags on your back?